The hardest thing about astrophotography, it's not about like finding the best camera or lens. It's really about getting out there. Today I'm headed to Big Sur because in my opinion, astrophotography is so difficult just getting out to a place and spending a lot of time in like dark locations. I'm just a little bit disappointed overall with this trip. A lot of times it's like driving these really long distances, and that can be extremely frustrating, especially when you're doing it by yourself. And every time I go out to do this, I'm on my own. So if you can, try to find someone that you can do this with you because it just makes it so much easier. So having a good camera for astrophotography, it all comes down to having a really good sensor. And there are a lot of like really good sensors that have just come out recently, like in the last few years. If you're shooting Sony or Nikon or Canon, like you're gonna have a really good sensor with all the new mirrorless cameras. There are some cameras that don't have so good sensors like the Canon RP, but if you're shooting with like the Canon R6, the Sony A7 III, any of the Sony cameras, or any of the Nikon mirrorless cameras like the Z6, the Z7, the second edition, any of those cameras are going to be perfectly fine for astrophotography. Now, if there's one camera that I would choose over all of them, I would actually choose the Sony A7C. And the reason I would choose this camera is because it's so lightweight. It's just really easy to carry around, especially like if you're doing like backcountry trips or if you're going like to far locations to do astrophotography and you want just like a really good light setup. I would stick with that. If you're thinking about using a star tracker, you have to really think about weight, and the Sony A7C is so lightweight. So that's like my number one camera that I recommend for astrophotography. It's lightweight. It has a really good sensor because it has the same sensor as the A7 III, the same sensor as the Sony Z6. It's just like a really good low light sensor, and you don't really need anything much better than that. I wouldn't say there is much, like there's not really any better sensor than that unless you go with a 12 megapixel sensor like the Sony A7S III or the ZV-E1, but you're not going to get as much megapixels, and I know that can be disappointing for some people. Now, you can shoot with a low megapixel sensor, and a lot of times, I mean, you can get really good results with that, but if you are worried about megapixels, you can just stack your images and you can get better photos if you stack your images anyway. So I would say if you are concerned, you could just get a lower light sensor like the Sony A7S III or the ZV-E1. Those aren't my go-to cameras, but I would say the Sony ZV-E1 definitely could be a really good, just amazing camera for astrophotography just because of the low light performance with that sensor. But if you're stacking these images anyway, you don't really need that much better of a sensor. You can do all of this with the Sony A7C. And that's my top camera recommendation for astrophotography because it's lightweight, it's super portable. You can put some lightweight lenses on it, and then you can put it on a tripod and a star tracker, and you don't have to worry about having all this heavy weight. I know a lot of people like to have heavy weight because it weighs their tripod down, but I just put a bag under my tripod to kind of keep the weight, like keep a heavy load on the tripod. So if there is any wind or anything, I don't get any vibrations. Okay, so yeah, number one choice, Sony A7C. Now, if you are on a budget, and there are so many cameras that you can get, if you get like an older DSLR camera, and they're gonna be like a little bit more expensive, but the Nikon, the D600 or the D610 is going to be a really good camera that you could use. It's like 20 something megapixels, and it has a good low light sensor in it. You can still find these. I was just looking at my phone earlier today, and I found like one for under $400. So that's a super cheap way to do this. And then you can get like a really, really good lens for these. And I would recommend like the Tamron. It's the Tamron 15 to 30 2.8. Has really good coma performance. Probably one of the best lenses I've seen for astrophotography. Another budget camera, if you're thinking about Canon, is just going to be like the EOS 5D Mark III or Mark IV. The Mark IV is a lot more expensive, but the 5D Mark III is really affordable, around $500. But the best budget option, I'm going to say, is probably going to be Nikon D610 or D600. Now, there are some other cameras that you could get that are just a little bit more, and this is actually what I would recommend. So if you can afford it, I would say spend a little bit more money and just get the Nikon Z6 or the Sony A7 III. Just, it doesn't really matter. The Nikon Z6 is a little bit cheaper. You're going to pay about $800 to $1,000. The Sony A7 III is you're going to pay about $1,100 to $1,200 used. Really good cameras for astrophotography. I've used the A7 III. I've used the A7R III. I found that the A7 III is a little bit better for astrophotography performance. I currently am shooting mostly my astrophotography on the A7 IV, and this is like an awesome camera. I would say that the A7 III, A7C, and A7 IV, like I wouldn't say that you really notice much of a difference at all. So I would say any of those cameras would be really good. But my personal recommendation just to make everything lightweight would just be the A7C. Now, should you think about megapixels with astrophotography? I personally like to have around 24 megapixels. That's kind of the sweet spot. Anything around 20, I'm like totally happy with. 12 megapixels, I think, is a little bit on the low side, but if you are primarily stacking photos, 12 megapixels is perfectly fine because you're going to bump your resolution when you start stacking and you're going to lower that noise, and I think it's just going to be perfectly fine. And then what you can do is you can just use like AI software to really increase that resolution. You can use Adobe Photoshop or Lightroom, and you can increase your resolution that way. You don't need a high megapixel camera to make these high quality, high resolution images. The software today is just so good that you don't need to spend more money on megapixels. So I would say just go with a 24 megapixel camera in general. If you don't do a lot of photography, but you want to do astrophotography, I mean, consider getting a 12 megapixel camera. If you primarily shoot video, get the Sony ZV-E1. That's an awesome camera for video, and then you can use it for astrophotography because you don't really need a shutter anyway because it doesn't have a shutter on it. You're going to be in mirrorless mode, which is going to pretty much act the same as if you had a shutter anyway. All right, so what about lenses? What are the best lenses for astrophotography? If you're shooting with Sony, I would say get the 20mm 1.8, or I would definitely consider getting the Sigma 14 to 24 2.8. This is a really good lens. I think it's probably one of the best lenses that you can get in general for astrophotography. But if you want a better aperture, I would say get the Sony 20mm 1.8. You could also get the Sony 20mm 1.4. I have both those lenses, and I actually prefer the Sony 20mm 1.8 just because I like the wider field of view. If you're shooting with Nikon, I would actually recommend using a non-native lens, like use the older f-mount and get a Tamron 15 to 30 2.8. You could also get an adapted lens with Sigma 14 to 24. If you want a native lens, you can get this Nikon 20mm 1.8. I don't think it's the best lens for astrophotography, but it is like a really good lens, and you're going to have really good performance out of it. Now, another reason I recommend Sony cameras in general is just because they have the low light mode. So you can actually assign a low light mode on your settings on your camera. So when you push the button, it does something where it opens the aperture and it opens the shutter. So if it's really dark outside and you can't see anything around you, like say it's pitch black, like you can still see things in your environment. A lot of times at night, it's really hard to compose an image because you can't see what's around you. And it's really nice to be able to do that with Sony's like low light mode. So that's definitely a reason why I use Sony cameras, just to make it easier to compose a photo. So those are the best mirrorless and DSLRs. What about compact cameras? So you can actually get like decent images with a compact camera. You're gonna need to stack your photos to get better noise performance, but you can open your shutter. You can put these cameras on star trackers just like any other camera. And so in general, I would actually go with Sony just because they make some really good 1-inch sensor cameras. You can go with pretty much any 1-inch sensor, but I prefer the Sony. The Sony ZV-E1 is a really good camera for that. You could also use any of the Sony RX cameras, like the RX 100s. If you want to even go with like a smaller sensor, you can actually use your smartphone, and I would recommend, if you are going that route, just get a Google Pixel. Google has just really good software for astrophotography in general. And I would say that would be like my top pick because it can actually track the stars, whereas a lot of other smartphones can't do that. So I would say just get a Google Pixel. All right, so that's what it's all about. It's all about having a good sensor. It's about having good megapixels, but more than anything, it's about going out and being motivated, because astrophotography can be extremely frustrating with just the conditions of going out late in the night, not getting sleep, spending tons of time driving to a faraway location, and then being in total darkness and it being pitch black. And it's just way easier if someone's with you. So I hope this kind of helped you make a decision on the best camera to buy for astrophotography. In my opinion, it's the Sony A7C, but there are so many other cameras that you can choose from, so don't limit yourself to just that. All right, guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you enjoyed learning about astrophotography, definitely subscribe below and leave your comments below. I want to hear your opinions on what you think the best camera for astrophotography is. Definitely open to hear your thoughts on bashing me against the A7C. In my opinion, I think it's one of the best for astrophotography, but I want to hear your thoughts. So please like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one. Thanks.